Did World War III just begin? The media doesn't want to talk about this, but if you dig deep enough, you can find articles and videos like this. This is a terrifying warning from one of Ukraine's former military chiefs saying that North Korea, Iran, and China are all standing beside Putin. How do you call it? What is World War III? What is the one pin drop that's going to ignite this? And all you hear in the news is stuff about Trump. You hear about Trump's plan, Trump this, Trump's cabinet. But then you've got the former administration pushing buttons, allowing missiles to be shot into Russia. It's like adding fuel to a raging fire. Why would you do that? But that is the question. Why? There's a lot of things we could really discuss with this, but I'm gonna hold that for another video. Today, I wanna talk about what would the economy look like if we were to enter World War III? What would that mean for you? Where are the opportunities in that? Not that that's a good thing, but we have to look at both sides, the bad and the good. Now, there are many theories out there as to what that looks like, but we're gonna hold that for another video. Today, we're gonna talk about what would it look like if the US went to war with Russia? Or would it be the US going to war with the BRICS? That's what we're gonna talk about today. My name's Chris Naugle. This is What Now? What's next if we enter World War III? Now, war has changed a lot since World War II. If you watch anything in history or watch any of the movies, you can see that the way wars were fought then are very different than the way wars are fought today. I mean, today we are way more globalized, we're way more connected, we're more reliant on technology than ever before in history, which actually is what I want to talk about. If we were to enter a world war, if US went to war with Russia and all their allies, what would be the play? What would be the concerns and the threats we should be looking at? Well, I've thought of a few, starting with EMPs and cyber attacks. This is nothing new. The EMPs are, but the cyber attacks have been happening. That's why cybersecurity is such a big thing today. You hear about it even meddling with elections. But an EMP, I've watched a couple videos on what an EMP would do. Now, an EMP would have no sound. No one would know what happened until it went black. And that's where chaos would start. Think about it. Anytime we lose power, anytime our grid goes down, anytime we have looting and riots and there's all sorts of things and the power goes out, it's pure chaos. Imagine an EMP being set off somewhere in the US and it just knocked out our entire grid. No internet, no phones, no communication, no computers, and darkness. But what about sanctions? We saw the US place sanctions on Russia when they started the Ukraine-Russia war. Sanctions against travel. They said no military from Russia could travel, so we put sanctions on them. We also put sanctions on saying we weren't gonna buy their oil, and we were gonna limit the credits that they would receive for any oil-related explorations. So if we entered a world war, those sanctions would go far and wide. They wouldn't just be Russia. They'd be Russia, China, India. They would go wide. They would have to cover all of the BRICS, because if we go to war, you're talking about a world war. You're not just talking about the US and Russia. You're talking about the US and all of our allies against Russia and all of their allies, which is a very important thing to remember. All this would hinge on all these countries coming together. So are you familiar with the BRICS? You've heard the term a lot, but let me give you a little bit of insight. And I'm gonna miss a few, but here is what the BRICS are. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But let's add on to that, because now you can add Ethiopia, Egypt, you could also add Iran and United Arab Emirates. Those are the allies of Russia. That is the BRICS. And the BRICS are trying to create a completely separate financial institution that will basically take over what the IMF is, what the World Bank is. Globalization, as we know it, just ended. And that's the hardest thing you need to think about. If we entered a world war, globalization completely shifts in the wrong way. All these countries band together, which basically means we aren't just fighting one, we are fighting all. And they are also fighting all of us. That's a world war. It's a terrible thought. It's a terrible thing if it were to happen. So again, back to why the former administration would throw fuel on an existing fire. And the popular vote is this. According to the Institute of Global Affairs, 94% of people in the US, 94% and 88% in Western Europe want a negotiated settlement to end the war in Ukraine. And why wouldn't we want that? Why do we want unnecessary deaths? You know, I find this hard to believe, and also our media doesn't cover it, which I guess I kind of understand. It's not really our war yet. But when you really look at it, and you just look at Russia, how many fathers, how many children, and how many mothers have died in this war? Well, the number is over 700,000 if you haven't been thinking about it. And we don't think about it because we're here in the US, in our comfortable homes, not thinking about what's going on over there in Ukraine, where cities and towns, just like the one you live in, are decimated, where the children of those people are not coming home because they're gone. But not only that, dads and moms won't get to know their kids. They're no different than us. They're not a third world country. They live a life very similar to what we live. And now everything is flipped upside down. Have you looked at the devastation that has happened in Ukraine? It is awful to see. The war is now over 1,000 days old, and it is hopefully, or was hopefully, nearing an end. Let's come to a settlement. That's what Trump has said he wants to do. Whether or not he can or cannot, he is confident that he can end this war. And Putin has even said he is willing to listen, but maybe not now. When US missiles, long-range missiles, go from Ukraine deep into Russia, hitting targets. And those missiles required US approval and coordinates. All this when we just had an election finish up, when we had what is supposed to be a peaceful transfer, but now we're authorizing missiles. And we're sending landmines over as if that's going to end the war. There's so much talk about the things that we're sending over there in an effort to try to end the war. You don't end a war by giving Ukraine more missiles, giving them more money. You end a war by coming to a settlement, by coming to some type of a common ground between Ukraine and Russia. And there's a mediator in the middle, and that is what Trump is trying to do. But it doesn't seem to be what Biden's administration is trying to do. But let's put all that missiles and World War talk out of the way, but let's focus on the economy, the US economy. What would things look like if we did go to war? What would be affected? What is the good and what is the bad? And I know you're probably thinking there's no good in a war, and you're right until you're wrong. So let's dive into that. This is a pretty easy thing to understand because you can just look at the past and you can understand wartime's effect and impact on the economy. And here's what it looks like. Let's start with the bad. Now I've got a whole list and I'm just going to read from the list real quick because I want you to understand this. Retail of non-essential goods. During war times, consumer spending shifts from essentials away from discretionary goods. I mean, that makes sense, does it not? So what does that mean? It means retail stores are going to have a hard time. They're really going to get hit hard because people are going to go to essential spending and they're not going to be buying things from the retail stores that we have come to know and love. Travel, that's going to get hit hard. Why? Well, there's going to be instability around the world and people aren't going to really feel safe traveling around. Not only that, higher fuel prices, because I'm sure there's going to be sanctions that hit us, and definitely not just us, but Putin has also said that he could cut oil and gas off from Europe. We remember that when the war started. Well, he's brought that back to the front and said that that is something in his control. So the sanctions would certainly make fuel more expensive, making it more expensive for all of us to travel. But did I mention the safety concerns? Can you imagine being on a plane, you're just listening to the music, you're watching a movie, and all of a sudden an EMP goes off? Game over. Unless you're flying in a glider, of course. I mean, then you'd be just fine because you would just glide down to the ground. But the last time I checked, the planes we're flying on, the jets, they require computers and lots of technology, and they have engines that when an EMP goes off, kaput. And they don't really have much of a glide path. I don't want to be on that plane during that, and nor do you. I'm gonna go a little faster, but entertainment. I mean, like in times of crisis, public attention and disposable income focuses on necessities, not leisure. So, I mean, the impact would hit theaters, it would hit streaming platforms, it would live events. I mean, not many people are gonna wanna go to a live event when we're in war. How about global supply chains? We've already seen this, and there's a book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. It's about geopolitical risks, and it talks all about this. So when you talk about the global supply, where do all the goods come from that we have come to enjoy? This computer, this mouse, this mug, these glasses, my iPhone. Global trade. We get a lot of the parts from overseas, not just China, but also Taiwan, and many other countries that definitely would be impacted, and the trade routes certainly would be disrupted in the event of a world war. But let's keep moving on. Infrastructure. Infrastructure certainly would be impacted. I mean, the industrial and construction industries would pivot. Why? Well, factories and construction resources pivot to produce military equipment. Just look back at any war, from Vietnam to World War, a lot of the manufacturers that made tractors started making tanks. A lot of the places that made private aviation started making military aircraft. Industry pivots. And what impact does that have? Well, lots of delays and reductions in civilian construction plans. Because, well, our stuff doesn't matter as much as winning the war. How about the automobile industry? You think that would be impacted? Well, certainly it would, because supply chains would be disrupted. So therefore, key components, semiconductor metals, reduced consumer spending on big ticket items like the new car would definitely take a back seat. Because again, we would focus on necessities, not luxuries. So the impact would definitely be a decline in revenue for the automobile industry. But the automobile industry wouldn't just lay down and say, oh my gosh, it's over. No, they would pivot, start making war machines. And I know a lot of us have short-term memory, but you remember back during COVID when the world shut down? GM and Ford started making respirators, not cars. That's exactly what we're talking about when we say pivot. They would have to, and they would. And another category that I must talk about is the real estate market. The real estate market is certainly going to see change. Why? Well, economic uncertainty isn't very good for real estate. How about inflation? Would inflation go up during wartime? How about higher interest rates during wartime? Absolutely. Those things would all reduce real estate investments, and they would slow the general housing market. Declining home prices is something you would expect to see during a period of time like this. But not only that, slower construction and development. So the projects that are in place right now would probably finish up, but you would see a lot less new development. So that's enough of the bad. I mean, but you must think, what goes down, something else must go up. So where is the opportunity during wartime? Well, it's quite simple. Let's just start with aerospace and defense companies. So let's talk about the why. Well, during a war, don't you think the government spends more money on this? Of course they do. They increase defense spending. They boost demand for military equipment, vehicles, and technology. So the impact is companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon all benefit. And don't forget about General Dynamics. All of those would see revenue growing. Now, I'm not making an investment recommendation, but I think logically you can just think through this. If you think we're going that direction, these might be the companies to look at. How about oil and gas prices? What do you think is going to happen there? Well, I can tell you what would happen. Price would go up. Sanctions would happen. Energy and oil would be in demand, and it would cost more. So if you were thinking through this and you were thinking of the disruptions in oil, especially if you're in Europe, in key trade routes, well, you would then start thinking energy companies start to look really freaking good. So if you were thinking like I am, well, the impact would be energy companies would show massive profits. Because when the price of oil goes up, who benefits? You got it, the oil companies. So would that not be a good place to look place a little bit of your investment capital? In wartime, I would say yes. Gold and precious metals. Now, this is a hot topic, and you hear a lot about this. And even with the election, there's been a big run-up in the price of silver and gold. But why? Well, fear? I think usually when gold goes up, it's usually fear-based. So precious metals are always a safe haven during unstable or unsettling economic times. In wartime, fits right in there. So the price of gold, silver, platinum, certainly would increase significantly. But again, when I talk about metals, I always like to preface that metals are just a store of wealth to protect principal. That is it. You're never going to literally knock it out of the park buying into gold. But it is a nice place to just store a little bit of cash. And I always say no more than 10% of your investment portfolio should go into any precious metals. That's just me. But again, not giving you investment advice. But the one thing I love to talk about, and this is a big opportunity just like it has been, it's government bonds. So in the event of a war, the government is going to sell bonds to raise money to pay for the war. It's happened before. Wartime expenses are high. We've got a lot of debt already, so what would the US government do? Well, they would issue more bonds. Now that is going to provide safety for the investors buying these bonds, and it's going to provide risk-averse investors a nice place to store their wealth and provide safety of principal. But the flip side to that is demand would go up. And as demand goes up, what also goes up? The price. So when's the best time to buy? Well, let's talk about the best time to plant a tree. 20 years ago was the best time, but right now is a pretty good time to start. So I've been talking about government bonds, specifically long duration government bonds, because right here, right now, I've been talking about this a lot, but the Fed has raised interest rates and now they are beginning the downward spiral. They're dropping interest rates. And as they drop interest rates, the price of bonds goes up. In the event of a war, demand goes up, which also drives price. So you got interest rates going down, you got demand going up, spells a really good story for long-term treasury bonds. So don't forget about your boring old government treasuries when you're thinking about how do we protect, but also how do we find opportunity and safety in the same little package. So if that were to happen, you would see a big demand in cybersecurity companies, right? So the impact would be companies like Palantir Technologies, CrowdStrike, which you've probably heard about, CyberArk Software. These would all benefit from heightened security threats. Now this one is one you should really pay attention to. Food. Food prices would go up. Wartime typically is inflationary. So therefore, you'd see food price go up, and that's mostly because of supply chains. We would have to go domestic. But that's okay. We have plenty of resources here in the US. We just don't use them because we're always shopping the world store for the cheapest price. But that's all going to come to an end anyway. All this stuff that you hear about in Trump's policies about tariffs and trying to bring industry back here is all an effort to get us, the United States of America, to focus on the important things in making and manufacturing goods and services here. Bring the jobs back home, bring America back. But that comes at a cost. But the cost is definitely worth it, as we would say. The juice is worth the squeeze. So when you're looking at food, you would definitely want to look at food companies. So what would be the impact of all that? Well, if we know the price of foods are going to go up, what would you look at? Maybe agricultural companies. You might look at companies that supply, food here, and you'd want to make sure that they are pretty resilient to the trade routes being disrupted. But with all that disruption, let me disrupt you here real quick and talk about something else that's important. What's important is that you get the information you need. It's very important that you know what's coming, how to react to it, and you can do that right here by clicking the subscribe button. There's also a little bell. I would highly suggest that you punch the bell. See, that was kind of like what Mike Tyson, when he fights, he's got a wicked left hook. But here was Mike Tyson's left hook in the fight. Oh, sorry. Gotcha. Let's not do a gotcha. Let's just click the little button so that you're notified every time we go live right here on this YouTube channel. But let's get back into it. Utility prices. What's going to happen to utility prices? Well, a lot could happen. There's definitely going to be an increased demand for things like energy and gas and all those other things. And utility companies, well, during wartime, the prices tend to go up, which means their profits tend to go up. Now, utility companies are usually a pretty good investment because they do often pay dividends, but you want to make sure that you know when to hold them and when to fold them. And during wartime, I would say you should definitely start looking at some energy producers and some utility companies for that little old portfolio that you've got going on. And this one, you should already know, telecommunications. During wartime, you're gonna be calling your loved ones, hey, everything okay over there? Yep, that EMP or that thing or whatever. You're gonna wanna make sure that you have good telecommunications so that we can all communicate during these times. Now, there's gonna be disruption there. So one of the impacts and one of the things you could look at is you could look at companies that are providing telecommunications. You know all the companies from Verizon to AT&T, T-Mobile, all of them. Those would serve to be good companies to look at in the event of a war. So let's not leave out healthcare and pharmaceuticals because in wartime, well, healthcare could be a big concern. But not just that, there's gonna be lots of injuries for our military. All these things are gonna require medical supplies. Public health concerns are gonna drive the demand of healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So unfortunately, the impact, you're gonna wanna look at companies that provide these pharmaceuticals and healthcare. And these last two you probably already know, but military infrastructure. During wartime, the government invests heavily in our bases, and that infrastructure is definitely something they spend a lot of money on. So what is the impact? Well, the impact is you might want to look at some of those contractors and those engineering firms that are contracted for the military's benefit. And last but not least, let's look at the one company that is sure to be a winner in this one because they were a winner during the pandemic shutdown, and that is Amazon. Why? Well, because we're gonna probably not feel super comfortable going out in the beginning of this, but we're gonna be comfortable going on our computer, if the computer still works, and ordering your goods and services from, yes, you've got it, Amazon. Essential goods and services. So Amazon would serve to be another company you'd want to look at in the event of World War III. Now listen, all this sounds awful, I know, but wouldn't it be best to get your house in order and get your mind in order? Because if this did happen, you would already be ahead of the curve. And at the end of the day, it's all about stability, isn't it? It's about you feeling safe. It's about you being protected, and it's about your stability and your family's stability. So that's really what we're trying to do. Talk about the good, the bad, and the essentials. And these are the essentials you need to be focused on. And the one thing you do not want to do is act out of emotion. You got to be logical about this, which is why I'm trying to get you to set a plan. Whether or not the plan ever is needed, having a plan is always the best path. You're going to want to find safe places to store your wealth. I talked about a few of them, but you'd want to look at treasury bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. You definitely don't want to leave out those specially designed and engineered whole life insurance policies that pay dividends because they're from mutually owned companies. And also, the one thing I always say, we're talking about control. Well, now is time to take back control of your money, and that is only done by you learning how to be your own bank. Which brings me to another little thing. If you've liked this video, you're going to want to check this video out, BYO Bank. Be your own bank. Check that video out, take back control of your money, and do that by changing just one thing and adding one step. Thanks for joining me. My name's Chris Naugle. This is another episode of What Now? What's Next if we go into World War III? We'll see you next time.